This is my third talk on my view of Glacier View, and this is about the difference between the consensus and the 10-point statement, which can be a bit confusing. As clarification of the various papers at Glacier View, there was Des's Glacier View manuscript of over 900 pages that is available online. There were two consensus statements, one on the biblical data and one on Ellen White, and these were produced from the week's work and the committees of the groups that met every day, a combination of administrators and scholars. They had their little meetings in the morning. We weren't part of it. In each morning meeting, there were certain questions to answer. The response to each question was recorded and voted on, and a spokesperson for each group presented the findings in the afternoon plenary sessions. That's how I think it worked. But remember, I was present, but I wasn't in those meetings. And the two consensus statements were written up from the notes that were taken throughout the whole week. So they represented the views on Ellen White's position and the Bible position from the group at large. I know I've got this later, but I'll fit in here. The consensus statements were largely written up by Bill Johnson, Fritz Guy, and I believe Duncan Eva was involved. Some of these details Milton Hook would have dealt with. There was also a 10-point statement produced by a group of 6. This was an addition. It seems to have been organised, as Norman says, by Neil Wilson. And he asked Norman, for instance, to participate. The statement gave 10 points summarising the differences between traditional Adventism and Des. And note in his talk, when Norman's talking about the 12 points, they have to do with the consensus statement, areas where Des believed that the group moved towards his manuscript or were in agreement. So don't get the 10-point statement and the 12 points from the consensus statement confused. They're entirely different. When I wrote this script, I questioned Norm's comment that the reason the consensus and Des's book shared ideas was merely that the scholars were drifting that way in their times, not that they were following Des. But when I read this to Des, he said it was true of the people who mainly wrote the consensus statements, Bill Johnson, Fritz Guy. And Des just told me that Bill Johnson told Hamill at Glacier View that the scholars agreed with Des. But going back to Norm's comment, if this was current thinking, why did the Darkom series after Glacier View go backwards in thinking and not forward? I suppose different people wrote Darkom than the consensus statements, but Darkom suggests many were not au fait with the current thinking of some scholars in the Adventist Church as represented in the consensus statements. And I also have to ask the question, who has spoken out on all these issues since? Because to do so means to be axed. But Norman would know better than I would about such progress, since at most I am a fringe dweller of Adventism. I do not agree that the 10-point statement was mainly used to inform administrators about the various points of contention and sort of died on the Thursday night of Glacier View, which Norman appears to say in his talk. May have misunderstood him. The 10-point statement was written to point out where Des differed from the traditional view that the Church taught, and that statement could have been written without Glacier view happening at all. I believe the 10-point statement, different to the consensus statement, was produced for a specific purpose, to fire Des. And Des agrees that was the case. Now, Des wrote that in my script. I didn't write that. Neil Wilson said in the opening talk at Glacier View that in the Dallas General Conference, which had taken place earlier that year, they had tightened up their doctrinal position, came out with the 27 fundamentals, and he said this group, at Glacier View, were not going to bring in anything new. And Des and I knew when we heard that what the outcome of Glacier View would be. Neil Wilson stated this unequivocally. There were some in that group of 6 who wrote the 10-point statement that Dr. Young mentioned, who wouldn't have believed in the traditional viewpoint themselves. The statement had some Bible texts in it, but none that constituted evidence for the traditional view. It just pointed out differences. You can tell from what Norman goes on to say in video 4 what his beliefs are. He couldn't have agreed to the 10-point himself. Neither could Arthur Furch, who opposed Des at Glacier View and wrote for Darcom. Like Alwyn Salem, also at Glacier View, Arthur knew all the issues. Alwyn chose silence, and Arthur had something of a conflict of interest because he took over Des's job at Avondale. However, Norman and the others were not told how the statement was going to be used. He and the others were not present in the Friday afternoon meeting, whereas I was. The 10-point statement was used to fire Des as far as doctrinal differences were concerned. The only time the consensus statement was mentioned in that meeting was by Des, when he told them it conceded a number of important points similar to his manuscript. One of the vice presidents stated that if he'd known that, he wouldn't have voted for it, a statement that says a lot. It also shows that there was a vote on the consensus statement, though I mentioned before that Milton Hook says he could not find a record of the vote.